We are starving. My body is breaking down. My mother is collapsing from exhaustion. My cousin cheats death every day for a morsel of aid. Gaza's children are dying in front of our eyes, and we are powerless to stop to help them. This is not a natural disaster. This is a crime, orchestrated and sustained by the Israeli regime, and enabled by the silence and inaction of world powers. This webinar brings together leading experts in their respective fields. Discussions will focus on the legal and humanitarian dimensions of this ongoing crime, with documented testimonies, legal analysis, and proposals for concrete actions to break the blockade and hold those responsible accountable. The topics discussed today will include starvation as an Israeli war crime in Gaza, stories and forensic evidence of those who have died of hunger, militarization of aid and the distribution by non-UN entities, legal classification of starvation under international humanitarian law, and concrete steps to break the blockade and save lives. I would like to welcome our distinguished speakers. First, we will have Reverend Munther Isaac, the pastor of the Evangelical Lutheran Church of Hope in Ramallah. Welcome, Reverend Munther Isaac. It's good to see you again.
Thank you. Dear friends who joined us from different parts of the world and who are watching live. It's really hard to continue to speak about this ongoing tragedy that is unfolding in front of the whole world to see in Gaza, and we feel broken and helpless, unable to stop this. This is really unprecedented if you think of it, the fact that we are watching a genocide through starvation unfold life on earth, and all the systems and structures of the world that we thought were there to serve humanity, to defend the weak, to defend the vulnerable, so that never again truly becomes never again. All of that failed. It's really a reckoning moment. And if I may speak here as a faith leader, this is a low point for all of us, because we have failed to stop this. Many of us tried, yet many were silent. Many actually justified, defended, called it a war of self-defense. But I think we're all, as a humanity, we need to think that we're all responsible for this. It's a moral failure on epic proportions. The fact that we're watching children being starved, not because there's a famine and not because natural disaster, but because superpowers are not willing to act and demand sanctions or to force Israel to let food and aid get in. And I really mean that this is a low point that demands reckoning. And again, yes, many have spoken. Many have spoken from the beginning. Let's not forget, many have been working, advocating non-tirelessly from the faith community to stop this. And I'm really not sure what to make of those who just issued condemnations now, whether we can really accept such an apology, given that you were silent for many months. At the same time, we can't just feel sorry about ourselves because there is a genocide in Gaza that we have to continue to work to stop. We owe it to them. We can't just feel helpless, and we owe it to the children of Gaza. So if I said we failed, and I think we did, that means we need to work harder. That means we need to intensify our efforts. And that means we need to unite even stronger in our demands. And the demand is clear: immediate intervention to stop this, to allow food and aid to enter, immediate intervention. And I urge all faith leaders to join in this calling that we need immediate intervention. This can't express this more. And at the same time, we need to really think beyond that. How did we allow this to happen? And we need to call for sanctions. And we need to ask how did Israel get away with this? Because no one's held accountable. And if we created and invested in all of that, I'm talking now we as collective humanity, invested in these structures, these systems, the International Court of Justice, the International Criminal Court, United Nations, and then we failed to stop a genocide that we're watching, then what would we have? So this is really an urgent moment. This is a very, very serious moment. And I would even go beyond just demanding sanctions to call for boycotting those who are complicit in this genocide, those who are not willing to even recognize the events in Gaza as the genocide, because it's an assault against the humanity of the Palestinians, especially the children of Gaza who are being starved to death. So it's time to mobilize with strong demands, not just a ceasefire and immediate intervention. And again, I urge my fellow faith leaders, don't just condemn, don't just be appalled, don't just say we are concerned, but demand action, demand accountability, boycott if needed, demand sanctions and weapons, make your voices heard, mobilize in streets and grassroots movements, because again, this is a very, very dark moment in our history that demands different responses. Let's remember what's at stake, the failure of a whole system. It's Palestine now, it's Gaza now, God knows who's next. We are enabling the rule of might is right. Is this the kind of future we want to leave to our children? And if faith leaders are not the first to move and act and demand change, then who will? And maybe in the end, just a word to the people in Gaza. I don't know if they can watch this. And as I watch the starvation, the humiliation, even being still waiting to get food, I want to just assure them that they have dignity. The world does not. They have honor. The world and world leaders do not. They are the honorable ones here, because we have all failed to maintain the sanctity of life, and we have all failed to protect the vulnerable and the powerless. So let's continue in our efforts and demand immediate intervention. Let aid enter, ceasefire now, and let's hold those who allowed this accountable. Thank you.
Thank you, Reverend. We're going to go next to Chris Gunness, former chief spokesperson for UNRWA.
Sorry, I just needed to unmute myself. Thank you so much, and it's a real honor to be on this panel and to speak after the pastor whose views and whose words I echo and endorse wholeheartedly. If I may, I would like to begin by giving some background, because I often think it's, when we look at these live streamed pictures of starvation, ethnic cleansing and genocide, it's easy to forget how we got here. And of course, Raphael Lemkin, the man who coined the phrase genocide, was very clear that genocide is a continuum. It's not a one-off act. It's something that goes on and on. And if we look at what the context is for Gaza, 66% of people in Gaza are refugees or descendants of refugees, which makes them refugees themselves, from 1948. So they fled or were forced to flee their homes in 1948, and they took refuge in Gaza, which is why there are so many refugee camps in Gaza where UNRWA has its operations. So that's the first part of the context, the dispossession of 2/3 of Gaza in 1948. Then we have the occupation, which began in 1967, and the consequent deprivations that we saw of land being confiscated, of the wholesale denial of rights and of human dignity. And then we move on to 2007, which is when the blockade of Gaza was imposed almost totally, both in terms of goods going in. So UNRWA, that I used to work for, we would have to have every can of tinned food cleared by the Israelis, everything. And of course, that then became a bottleneck, which the occupation authorities could use to strangle Gaza. And since the 7th of October 2023, what we've seen is an almost total strangulation. At times, there have been months where literally nothing has gone into Gaza. And let us not forget that Gaza has a fence built around it. It's unique in the annals of contemporary warfare in being a war zone where there is nowhere safe. There's nowhere safe to run. They cannot escape. And in that context, we now have the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation delivering aid in what is effectively an agricultural cattle area fenced off, where people come like cattle, and indeed they're being slaughtered like cattle at the rate of about 50 people a day in the 6 or more weeks since the GHF has been operational, about 1,000 people, and that's not very much less than the number of people who were killed in the October the 7th attack. Let's not forget that. But whereas there was huge global outrage for the October 7th attack, there's so little outrage or meaningful outrage. So that's the context. I'd like to pick up on what the Reverend said about accountability, because I think accountability is an area where we can meaningfully talk of something that we can do beyond words. And there are 3 levels of accountability, I would say. There's the international court, so both the ICJ, the International Court of Justice in The Hague, and the International Criminal Court, also in The Hague. The International Criminal Court, it did issue arrest warrants for 3 Hamas leaders who have now been killed by the Israelis, but there are open arrest warrants for the former Israeli Defense Minister, Yoav Gallant, and Benjamin Netanyahu. It is an obligation on all 123 state parties to the court, to the ICC, to arrest and hand over these 2 men if ever they fly over their airspace or come across borders into their jurisdiction. So that's one area. The other part of international justice is the ICJ, where the South African government has taken a case accusing the Israeli government of violating the Genocide Convention. And I would like to see more member states of the United Nations coming forward and supporting that. On the 26th of January last year, the ICJ, imposed what are called provisional measures, including the full humanitarian access. So the court demanded that Gaza effectively should be flooded with aid. And what we've seen is the absolute reverse. And state parties have an obligation to make sure that those provisional measures are implemented. And if they fail to, then they themselves open themselves up to possible sanctions and other measures. So I think point number 1, those mechanisms need to be activated. We all need to be saying to our elected representatives, what are you doing as state parties to the Rome Statute to make sure that these provisional measures are implemented and that Gaza is flooded with aid? Secondly, we need to support the universal jurisdiction measures which are being taken by some extraordinary Palestinian groups themselves, such as the Hind Rajab group based in Brussels, which have been looking at the social media postings, very arrogant postings of Israeli soldiers who film themselves doing selfies of, blowing up housing blocks, blowing up civilians, going into homes, looting wardrobes, and all of those sort of things are there and online, and we need to make sure that governments support and prosecution authorities support these individual efforts to bring the Israelis to accountability. Because if we can send a powerful signal that people who perpetrate these appalling atrocity crimes will be prosecuted, then at least there's some even minimal hope that in the future other would-be criminals perhaps might be deterred. And then very lastly, on accountability, I think we have to look at the recent and very brilliant report of the UN Rapporteur for the situation of human rights in occupied Palestine, Francesca Albanese. Her report, which is entitled From the Economy of Occupation to the Economy of Genocide, names and shames specific universities, companies and other entities that are profiteering from the genocide. And we need to make sure that her recommendations, Francesca's excellent recommendations, are fully implemented. And again, we need to make sure that our elected representatives are aware that we, the people, are looking at what they're doing in terms of blockading Israel, making sure that there's no military support for the genocide. And I want to end with one final observation, and it's very much in line with what the Reverend was saying about never again. What we're now seeing is the army of a people against whom the absolutely appalling events of the Second World War, the Holocaust, were perpetrated. And that very army is now, frankly, doing things which are chillingly redolent and reminiscent of what happened during the Second World War. Indeed, Ehud Olmert, the former Israeli prime minister, is on record as saying that Israel is creating a concentration camp in southern Gaza. That's what he said. So, let us be very careful, because the motto of all of that was never again. And yet the very army of the people against whom that was perpetrated are themselves showing that never again is really not worth the paper it's printed on. And as we've been hearing on this panel, if we are able to hold our heads high and say to the next generation, this will never happen again, then we have to look at our own actions and ask ourselves the question, what are we doing now to make sure this does not happen? And I've given, I think, some pointers as to what we have to do to make sure that we can truly live up to this idea of never again. It also applies to the Palestinians, and it applies to the children who are being killed, starved to death at the rate of at least 20 a day. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. I'm going to move on to Professor Michael Lynk, former UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights in the Palestinian Territories. Professor Lynk, can you unmute yourself, please?
That must be the most common phrase in the 21st century. Can you please unmute yourself? Sorry about that. I'm very pleased to be part of this panel. It's an honor to be joining such distinguished guests, but alas, we're here to talk about a very grave moment in modern human history. I want to speak very briefly about the obligations of international law. Some say that international law is worthless, and what has been perpetrated in Gaza over the last 22 months is exhibit A with respect to that. I want to be able to say that international law actually has standing, that international law actually is important for all of us. It's the one common human document, if you like, that we've created in the last 80 years in the ashes of the Second World War that virtually every country in the world has signed on to. They themselves have put their signatures on all of these human rights and humanitarian conventions and treaties. They can be held now by pointing to the fact that they are falling short of what they promised us that they would wind up doing. So what does international law say with respect to this? First of all, and if we recall the history of the 20th century as to why these laws with respect to the deliberate infliction of starvation on a civilian population came into account. We have to remember the German genocide in Namibia in 1904 and 1906, where the German troops used starvation and the cutting off of water supplies to a number of the Namibian people as a means of trying to exert control. We saw this again with respect to the Armenian genocide against the Armenians in 1915, or the Allied blockade of Lebanon during the First World War, where starvation wound up being used. We see this again with the Nigerian genocide in Biafra in the late 1960s. And here we are today in the 21st century, grappling with a 20th century problem, that is the continued settler colonialism of Palestine, and the willingness of the international community to forget their obligations with respect to self-determination, to forget their obligations with respect to upholding UN resolutions and modern international law, enforcing a military blockade with the knowledge that it's going to starve the civilian population is a clear violation of international law, is a violation of the Geneva Conventions, the beating heart of international humanitarian law. It's a violation in many cases of the crime against humanity, and in certain circumstances, it can be part of the violation of the 1948 Genocide Convention. What we have on the record so far is that, as Chris has mentioned, that the International Criminal Court found reason to believe that Israel has used starvation as a method of warfare in issuing its arrest warrants against Benjamin Netanyahu and former Defense Minister Yoav Gallant in November of 2024. And that was before starvation reached the peak that it's reached right now. We are witnessing the denial of food, leading to starvation, leading to famine, which is almost unheard of in the modern world. We also have, as Chris has mentioned, the ICJ provisional measures based on the application brought by South Africa in January of 2024 against Israel under the Genocide Convention. And we've had 3 issuances of provisional measures by the International Court of Justice in January, March, and May of 2024, including the warning that the use of starvation is prohibited under international law, and that Israel must allow the free flow of humanitarian aid into Gaza at scale to the population of the 2.2 million Palestinians who wind up living there. By deliberately cutting off vital supplies, including those relating to sexual and reproductive health, Israel is once again weaponizing aid, as the UN has said repeatedly over the last 4 months. These are serious violations of both international human rights law, international humanitarian law. They amount very likely to war crimes and crimes against humanity under the Rome Statute of 1998. And we have to keep in mind that the 1948 Genocide Convention prohibits the deliberate infliction on a group of conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction, whole or in part. My successor, Francesca Albanese, has been very clear in the last 3 reports that she has issued beginning in March 2024 that a genocide is unfolding in Gaza. She is among the only UN officials that I recall who've actually used the G word in describing what is going on. I have seen other UN officials walk right up to the red line and say what we're witnessing is our conditions of life that may bring about the destruction of a group, which echoes the definition of genocide in the 1948 Genocide Convention, but they haven't yet crossed that line that we need to hear with respect to genocide. But we are having other responsible and respected voices in international politics say this. We've had Joseph Borrell, the former vice president for the European Union with respect to international affairs, say in May that this is a genocide. We've had Martin Griffiths, the former UN Undersecretary for Humanitarian Aid, say in June of this year that this is a genocide. We've had Amnesty International say that it's a genocide. Genocide and the creation of the Genocide Convention wasn't put into place in order to allow historians 20 years from now or 30 years from now to use a yardstick of to determine that there was a genocide in the distant past. The Genocide Convention is there to compel action now against a genocide or the possible genocide in the making. And that's what we see with starvation as the cornerstone of Israeli action with respect to Gaza, beginning in full force in March of 2025, when it completely blocked all humanitarian aid wind up entering. Let me end off with this. What matters is not what countries say. I welcome the statement made by 28 nations of the global north issued earlier on this week with respect to Gaza. But it doesn't matter what they say. It matters what they do. This war, this military campaign, and this genocide, this use of starvation could not have gone a day longer had the countries of the global north used their power through their military supplies to Israel and through their trade and diplomatic relations with Israel. They could have cut that off, and this war would have stopped the day after with regards to this. This is what needs to happen, not strong words, strong action. Thank you very much.
So I'm going to go through and have everyone speak, and then we're going to have some time for questions and debate after. So next, I'd like to go on to Solomon Sacco, the legal advisor of the OHCHR OPT office. Thank you, Solomon.
Good afternoon, and thank you. Thank you for this invitation. I am extremely honored to be on this panel, and I echo everything that's just been said. I would like to take as my departure the background that Chris gave. Starvation, hunger, the blockade and closure of Gaza did not start on the 7th of October, but predates that. And even before that, the UN Human Rights Office repeatedly raised concerns of collective punishment in the blockade and use of hunger against Gaza. However, after the 7th of October, we and numerous human rights experts warned that the subsequent total siege, blockade, and closure of Gaza and other unlawful impediments to the entry and distribution of the necessities of life would cause death by starvation. This is now happening. Palestinians in Gaza are starving to death. More than 100 reported killed as a foreseen consequences of policies and actions of the Israeli military. Palestinians are not dying from hunger by mistake. This is a direct consequence of policies and practices put in place. These numbers are only of those recorded. People are collapsing in the street from hunger. Hospitals have been destroyed and overwhelmed. The population is displaced. And therefore, many more are likely dying outside of hospitals and are not being recorded. The situation is truly catastrophic. In this context, Palestinians are being forced to choose between starving to death or being shot dead or seriously injured by the Israeli military when trying to access food. The number of casualties among people trying to access food supplies was reported yesterday to have reached 1,060 dead and more than 7,207 injured since 27 May 2025, when the Israeli-US mechanism came into place. Many of these killings have been committed around GHF sites, but some have also been perpetrated as Palestinians wait for UN convoys. Although yesterday we saw reports of 150 truckloads being picked up in Gaza, the truth is that restrictions and impediments continue, and these trucks are a drop in the ocean of the aid needed. Indeed, the numbers of trucks entering or being picked up in Gaza tells only a small part of the story. Israel has failed to take steps to ensure that humanitarian actors can safely distribute humanitarian assistance across Gaza. Israel's continued attacks in Gaza have served to dismantle and destroy Gaza's governance and law enforcement structures, contributing to a deterioration of public order that threatens the safety of Palestinians and their access to basic services and life-saving humanitarian aid. The unlawful targeting of the civilian police has had the effect of escalating disorder in Gaza, further violating Israel's obligation as the occupying power to restore and maintain civil life and public order. This has had catastrophic impacts on the distribution of humanitarian assistance and directly and foreseeably contributed to the starvation we are now seeing. Another factor directly leading to starvation have been the attacks that have damaged Gaza's food production capabilities. For example, combined with the destruction of agricultural land and other food production infrastructure, the targeting of Gaza's fishers and fishing infrastructure by the Israeli military has contributed to the risk of famine and growing protection concerns for vulnerable persons, creating conditions which threaten the survival of Gaza's population. Israel, as the occupying power, has the duty to ensure the provision of food and medical care for the population as needed. Furthermore, they have the obligation to facilitate access by international humanitarian service providers and to facilitate access of the civilian population to that assistance. The International Court of Justice, while confirming that there's a plausible risk to the right of the Palestinian people to be protected from genocide issued binding provisional measures on 28 March 2024 that Israel must take all measures to ensure, without delay and in cooperation with the UN, the unhindered provision at scale of aid and assistance to Gaza. However, Israel has continued its impediments to the UN and other humanitarian actors while introducing a militarized and limited mechanism that is in contradiction with international standards on aid distribution. It endangers civilians and contributes to the catastrophic humanitarian situation. It has the effect of consolidating the forced displacement of the Palestinian population, who are forced to move towards a limited number of GHF sites. The weaponization of food for civilians, in addition to restricting or preventing their access to life-sustaining services, constitutes a war crime and under certain circumstances may constitute elements of other crimes under international law. Indeed, one of the warrants issued for Israeli leaders was based on starvation as a method of war. Concerns also arise of the use of starvation to facilitate forcible transfer through the creation of a coercive environment, which may amount to unlawful transfer as a war crime and may, in certain circumstances, amount to the crime against humanity of forcible transfer. However, while it is important to note that the conduct of the military may give rise to individual criminal responsibility, the imperative remains to ensure that there is an end to these egregious violations of international law. And I want to echo previous speakers on this. The time for strong statements is over. There needs to be action. There must be pressure on the Israeli authorities to allow humanitarian aid into Gaza at scale. And scale means scale. There must be a flooding of humanitarian aid into Gaza. There must be a ceasefire. There must be an end to the shooting and targeting of civilians. The Israeli military must stop shooting at or otherwise killing and injuring people trying to get food. Civilians must be protected. Israel must also allow the entry of food and other humanitarian assistance needed to sustain the lives of Palestinians in accordance with international law and humanitarian principles. It must immediately and sustainably lift its unlawful restrictions on the work of the UN and other humanitarian actors. It must take steps to restore and ensure civil life and public order. Third states have the obligation to take concrete steps to ensure that Israel, the occupying power in Gaza, complies with its duty to ensure that sufficient food and life-saving necessities are provided for the population. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Solomon. Next, we're going to hear from Jeff Halper, who is the head of the Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions. Jeff, it's good to see you again.
Okay, thank you for having me. And again, I certainly support and acknowledge all the comments that have been made. I'd like to approach this from more of a political direction, since I'm not in a humanitarian organization, nor am I an international lawyer. And in a sense, as tragic as it is, the engineered starvation in Gaza that we all acknowledge. It's not a humanitarian crisis or a disaster. It's a man-made famine. It's an engineered mechanism of pacifying the Palestinian people. This is all a political matter. And although we have mechanisms like international law and so on, I mean they're not very effective because in the end the sanctions are only applied through political means, mainly the United Nations, or governments that sanction Israel or other countries, and that of course is all dependent upon politics, and Israel is very strong in terms of what I call its security politics. Its ability to, I wrote about this in War Against the People, its ability to parley its military prowess and also its technologies of repression internally, that in fact it learns on the Palestinians. If you look at Gaza in a sense as a part of the laboratory, in which Israel is developing tactics, and I think we have to look at this in that sort of a way, tactics and policies and weaponry and systems of surveillance and repression for political aims. This is really what it exports, including the idea of a security state. So not only is this a crime being committed in Gaza, specifically that we're talking about, I would argue that this is a part of in a sense, a plan or a sort of a tactical plan of repression that Israel is actually importing to other countries. Not that it's going to encourage other countries to starve populations that it wants to starve, but that in fact there is a logic and there's a system and there's an idea of repression, including the narrative that's very strong that someone mentioned, that justifies it in terms of terrorism and criminalization and so on. So I think we have to look at this in a political way, but also look at this as a model that could be actually, in other words, instead of being condemned and ended here in Gaza in the Palestinian context, could actually be a model that's exported, and it might be an engineered starvation that's a part of a pacification and displacement process that we're going to see in other countries. I think we have to be aware of that. And we always talk about Zionism as settler colonialism, and we use that as kind of a mantra, but that really means something. And just as I think Chris said, Lemkin's idea of genocide was it's a continuation. So, it isn't a one-off sort of a thing. So is settler colonialism. And all of this could have been predicted. Settler colonialism has a logic, it has a structure, it has a process, and policies, again, that I think Israel is developing on the Palestinians and then exporting to other places. And in particular, I think this is a part of a pacification process that's built into the settler colonial project. In other words, settler colonialism, a genocide is built into settler colonialism because the whole idea is to replace one people with another, to transform Palestine into Israel, to Judaize. A lot of the terminology that's most important for understanding this, and even for mobilizing public opinion, isn't included in the legal language. We talk about genocide, we talk about apartheid, we talk about occupation. Those are very important terms that have legal references. But a term like Judaization, or even pacification, and settler colonialism, these are terms that really grab the essence, the logic of what Israel is doing. You begin to understand why Israel is doing it, but they don't have legal references. And so we tend sometimes not to use them. But you can't Judaize a country, without genocide. And so on the one hand, I think what we have to do, I'm really in a political way trying to relate to the question of how do we fight this? I don't know if in the immediate arena, of course, where there's no time to organize or anything else, build campaigns, we have to end the starvation immediately. But from the point of view of this policy of starvation and of settler colonialism, I think we have to get this analysis through. I don't think it's enough simply to appeal to international law and to say, the ICG has done this, the ICC has done this. There are human rights conventions in the UN, Francesca's wonderful work in the UN and so on. Those are references that have a meaning, they're pertinent, but over time, you have to deal with these issues over time and build a public consciousness. And there, I think, groups maybe that are more political should be dealing more with analysis so people understand why this is happening, the logic of it all, and we can anticipate this. And then at the same time, I think what we're lacking are those organizations that can then mobilize in order to oppose what we see as coming down the line or what's happening, like engineered starvation or like pacification. And here we're really lacking. I mean, there's dozens of organizations abroad that are doing excellent work. I mean, there's mobilizations all over the world. Certainly, this is becoming a public issue. It's getting into the media. Governments are dealing with the starvation issue and Gaza, of course. But again, we're lacking that ability to in an organized, effective way to oppose these policies. And one of the things I would suggest that we're missing is what there used to be. Some of you probably remember this, an international a coordinating committee on Palestine. There used to be this, 40 or 50 years ago, even. In other words, we're missing a coordinating body that can put together the people that are dealing with international law that the activists don't know about very well, and the activist community that has this ability to mobilize, and let's say academics or people that understand settler colonialism that can provide that analysis. And so if we can put those things together, the activism, the analysis, mobilizing the instruments we have, then we have a chance to more effectively mount campaigns, even in the short term, to fight and end issues like this engineered starvation that's happening in Gaza. And so what I would say is, this isn't an answer for ending this immediately, but certainly we have to try to more coordinate our organizations. I would suggest, and some of you could be involved with this because you've been involved with this, organizing an international coordinating committee on Palestine that is able to bring groups from all over the world together. And I think there's a disconnect between what's happening in the world and the Palestinians here as well. Palestinians here often aren't brought into those international networks. And so an international coordinating committee on Palestine could bridge that gap between international organizing and the Palestinian input that's really important. This doesn't relate specifically. I think all of you have really talked in detail about what's happening, the actual starvation and so on. What I'm trying to say is I think we're all, and like Chris mentioned the word, I think Chris, powerlessness. I think we're all feeling powerlessness. The tools are there, the instruments are there, the international laws are there, and so on. But we're not able to really effectively end this campaign of engineered starvation. And I think we have to begin to address that in some way. So thank you.
Thank you, Jeff. Next up, we're going to hear Professor Haim Bresheeth, Professor of Film Studies at SOAS.
Thank you. I'm speaking to you today following very illustrious speakers, which I'm honored to join, on behalf of many, many hundreds of thousands of anti-Zionist Jews, which have organized globally to join the Palestinians in the struggle for liberation and against the Zionist settler colonial state, which oppresses and genocides the Palestinians, as we know. I will try not to repeat all the arguments which I'm agreed with, made by the other speakers. As anti-Zionist Jews, we have met in Vienna in June, more than 1,000 of us, speaking on behalf of many thousands that couldn't come to the Congress in Vienna, about means and ways and sanctions to stop this genocide. We stand together with all Palestinians in Palestine and elsewhere against Zionism and its genocidal and other crimes. We support the UN human rights provision, which allows people under illegal occupation to oppose the occupying power with any means at their disposal. It is vital that Jews of conscience everywhere unite in opposing Zionism, in collaboration and solidarity with the global movement for Palestinian liberation. We are committed to expanding our movement beyond its European roots to include anti-Zionist voices from around the world, including the global South. And we condemn without qualifications all Israeli war crimes committed since October the 7th, and indeed before October the 7th, which include ethnic cleansing, militarized apartheid, herbicide, scholasticide, medicide, mass starvation as an instrument of forced expulsion of more than 2 million Gazans, and an extant genocide of hundreds of thousands, the worst crime of our time. We understand that these crimes could not actually take place without the enthusiastic support offered by the whole West, by arming, financing, and active political and diplomatic support by the US, EU, UK, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. By supporting and arming the genocidal Israel, these states are themselves guilty of genocide, according to the Genocide Convention of 1948. We call on all states and all societies to meet obligations specified in the Convention for the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, and so that they all can stop the Gaza genocide. Now, I want to make a specific case as a Jew, also as son of 2 survivors of Auschwitz, whose family was totally decimated by the Nazi genocide of Jews and others. Remember, it is not true that only 6 million Jews were killed by the Nazis in the Holocaust. 11 million Europeans and some non-Europeans were killed by the Nazis in the Second World War. So we are, in the name of those people, speaking now as Jews, saying there is nothing Jewish about what Israel is doing to the Palestinians. There never was. Israel is not a Jewish state. Israel is indeed a racist, anti-Semitic state. It is not speaking in our name. It is not speaking for us, and it's not speaking for any Jews or for any human beings anywhere. And to actually end this, we call for a number of sanctions which actually were enacted against other groups who committed crimes which are much less important. For example, in 1974, the UN General Assembly expelled South Africa from the General Assembly for the crime of apartheid. I will never argue that apartheid is not a serious crime. Indeed, it is one of the crimes of Israel. But what South Africa did to the Black population pales into insignificance almost compared to what Israel is doing to the Palestinians since 1948, and definitely since the 7th of October 2023. And therefore, we are calling on the UN General Assembly to step up to the plate and do what it must do, and that is expel Israel, a genocidal society, which actually commit a genocide which is democratic, because most of Israeli Jews are supporting this genocide. This is the first democratic genocide of humanity. We call on the General Assembly to eject Israel until it accepts in full all UN resolutions on Palestine, all of which it actually rejected since 1948. We also call on the European community to eject Israel and terminate the agreement of Israel as an associate member of the European community. This is actually against the rules of the EU, which do not allow a country involved in genocide, in ethnic cleansing, and in apartheid to be a member or an associate member of the EU. We call on the EU to respect its own laws and eject Israel from that membership. And we call on the UN to do something that they have done in other places, to put together an international protection force for all Palestinians, because we are not just talking about what is happening in Gaza. Thousands of Palestinians were killed in the West Bank since October the 7th. The level of mafia behavior in all the territories occupied by Israel in 1967 is incredible, and we ask the international community to send a protection force to stop the attacks against the Palestinians. No one at the moment is protecting the Palestinians because of the West that behaves like an imperial mafia. We ask for this to end, and without any waiting for more movements to be created, we ask the UN to enact what it is there to do, to protect, to stop the genocide, and to eject Israel from membership of the UN. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. So we do have one last speaker who is not able to be here, and we have a video recording from him, but we will watch that at the end. We would like to, I'd like to go through and have some discussion. One of the things that I did not hear brought up is, that I'd like to hear a little bit about is, to what level do we hold the media responsible? I've heard a lot about holding political entities accountable, but part of it is that I'm here in the United States, and if you are not actively looking for articles, if you're not actively looking information, it is very easy to not know what is happening. And as horrible as that sounds, that is the case. And a large part of that is because of failures of our media. We've heard of mass silencing of reporters, guides that refuse to use words such as genocide and settler colonialism. And how important do you think it is to pressure the media, and what tools do you suggest? You're welcome to unmute if anyone would like to take that question.
I would like to suggest from Britain that what is called public broadcast in Britain, the BBC and Channel 4, are actually not covering the genocide, but covering up the genocide. This they have done now for almost 2 years. And they speak for us. We pay for it. They are not private organizations. They are state organizations supported by public finance. We are paying a levy for these organizations to operate. And on our behalf, supposedly, they are silencing the genocide. The BBC has withdrawn 2 very important films that it has paid for to be made, about doctors and how they are being killed, and how medical personnel is being killed by the Israelis by targeting, not just bombing houses and some medics are dying there, but about, you know, shooting and destroying tens of ambulances, all the hospitals of Gaza, arresting and torturing, raping and killing the doctors who work or used to work when those hospitals were still operational. You know, even the Nazis in the Second World War did not close the only Jewish hospital in Berlin. It operated throughout the war and treated the few Jews that stayed in Berlin and survived the war. Israel has actually made medical support of Palestinians impossible. And this is not reported by, I'm speaking now for Britain only, but these are very important institutions because they are actually models of public broadcasts in many other organizations. I think they should be exposed, and this is what we are doing through different organizations. And every time that we try to demonstrate in front of the BBC, the police arrested us. Jews who are anti-Zionist are today 120 times more likely to be arrested than the number in the population is suggesting. So actually that shows you that Jews in Britain, like in the United States and many other places, are very vociferous in speaking for Palestine because they are arrested in huge numbers, especially when they actually act against the media, and at the moment, unfortunately, unsuccessfully. I think we should all act against the New York Times, against all those organs that are covering up the crimes of Israel. We are not doing enough in this area. I totally agree with you.
Thank you very much. I know that there's a couple of organizations that are working towards this and using tools to bring the media to account. But thank you very much for your words. Jeff, I wanted to ask you really quick. You've brought up the International Coordinating Committee on Palestine before. What are you doing to make this happen? Are you working on, is this a project that you're working on? Can you tell us more about this?
Well, I'm in touch with a number of people. I mean, Michael knows Kathy Bergen in Canada, who was the head of the International Coordinating Committee on Palestine when it was located in Geneva. This is many years ago. And I know today there's a European Coordinating Committee on Palestine, although they focus much more on working with the European Parliament. My only you know, as I said, you know, my big problem is our organization. I think everything is in place. The international laws are in place. People like Michael and Francesca and Chris and others that are here, you know, are very able and articulate in presenting the international laws and covenants and the mechanisms of sanctions and of holding Israel accountable. You know, the activist organizations, some of them are fairly effective in terms of organizing. I mean, you've got these huge rallies in London. You have some campaigns that are, you know, the BDS campaign is very well organized and so on. You have all of that, but it simply isn't coordinated. And my point is, and I think this relates directly to the starvation issue, because again, as I said, it's something that we saw coming. And even as one of the speakers said, there's been precedents to it. I mean, not only here with the Palestine, as Michael said, in other countries, Biafra, Namibia, and so on, but even in Gaza, and in the West Bank, there's been precedences. So in other words, our problem is that we're not surprised by these things. And in a way, the tone of this discussion, what do we do? How do we end this as it's happening? is in a way a discussion we should have had months and months, even years ago, before this engineered starvation arose, because we saw it coming. It's a part of the pacification, displacement, genocidal process of settler colonialism that we know. So my question is, how do we take our analyses, and how do we take the different mechanisms that exist in the international system, and how do we take our organizing capacities that are today spread out among all kinds of different organizations that are barely in touch with each other, and how do we sort of bring them together into a more organized sort of a framework? I think the activist groups don't really know the academic analysis. The international law people, human rights people, are sort of in that world, and they're not that connected to the activists and so on. And I think we have, in other words, to answer that question that you asked, the last question, how do we actually try to oppose effectively this starvation that's going on? I think the answer is we have to be more organized, we have to be more coordinated, because the pieces are in place and the people are in place, and the analysis is in place, but somehow we're still at the level of being kind of gadflies in a way, and we haven't really put together an effective political movement. That would be my reply.
Sounds like that is something we should start working on within the hour. This is I thank you very much. I always appreciate your ideas and the action, how action focused you are. One other, I would like to Professor Lynk, I would like to ask you specifically. I know that I think most of you are all in Europe. As I said, I'm in the United States, and you've talked about, several of you have talked about the level of repression, and Jeff, you had talked about the that Israel is creating a model of a military state to export, a state of oppression that they are exporting to other places in the world. We've been seeing this in the U.S. And if Los Angeles is a good example of that, as well as the recent disappearances of immigrants and such. Professor Lynk, what do you suggest that we can do here in the US? Because, to be honest, the US is largely the funder and enabler of the current genocide in Israel, and should be also held accountable.
One small correction. I live very close to the US, but I'm not in the US. I'm in Canada. And Canadians always want to make sure you know that difference.
We do.
Okay. But I do follow, obviously, what goes on in the United States very closely, particularly over the last 22 months. One of my areas of concern, obviously, is the repression going on at American universities. American students have been at the forefront over the last 22 months, and particularly during the spring and summer of 2024, with respect to mobilizing public opinion, with respect to resisting not only their university's complicity through investments or through academic ties with Israel, but also just raising the larger questions in society with respect to the solid American support, whether it be Democratic administration or a Republican administration, with respect to this. The wind for the moment has gone out of the sails of those students, but I think the lessons they have learned, both the victories that they achieved in setting up and sustaining these encampments on the campuses of almost every important American university, but also the lessons they've learned in the defeats and setbacks that they wound up suffering, with the police being ordered in, with universities wanting to strip them of student rights or expelling them, as well as what goes on with respect to the professors who wound up supporting them. These are all lessons I think they're going to ingrain. Yes, if you like, one step forward, two steps backward. But the fact that they raised these issues and did not bow to the initial overwhelming public narrative set by the White House and Congress with respect to Israel's acting only in self-defense. Israel is our ally, and as a trusted friend, we have to come and give them not only maintain but substantially increase the weaponry that we wind up sending to them, and increase the size of the diplomatic shield that we cast in order to enable Israel to continue what it's doing. These have all set, I think, important markers with respect to American public opinion. American public opinion in polling shows have actually more support for the Palestinians than it does for Israel, which is a substantial change in the wind vane in America. More Jews under the age of 35 are coming out as critical of Israel, of igniting these probably difficult family conversations over the degree of support for Israel and what must be opposed and what Israel has increasingly become in the past little while. You know, the hope is that you try to find that mobilization, which is slowly but surely coming, you know, by the primary victory of Zohar Mamdani, that the fact that these student leaders who led these encampments today will probably be, hopefully, running for public office in 10 to 15 years, or will become important political influencers in terms of changing public opinion. All of these are important. And the one question I would say is we probably don't have 10 to 15 years to wait for them to wind up maturing, given the scale of the destruction now, and at least the evident military victory that Israel is achieving and setting back the Palestinian movement for self-determination. But, you know, when I read at least liberal opinion in the United States, and it does occasionally creep into the New York Times, it does creep into the Wall Street Journal or the Washington Post. It's becoming more dominant in mainstream periodicals like the New York Review of Books or the New Yorker or the Nation magazine. With respect to Israel, we know that we're in the midst of a fundamental change that we can't see where it's going, but we know that it's heading away from this strong, either ironclad support for Israel or the indifference with respect to the issue of Israel and Palestine, because it was deemed to be too controversial, and the threat always opposed of being labeled an anti-Semite for raising difficult questions with respect to not only Israel and Palestine, but American support for that as well. So I think these are all things we have to keep in mind as we look forward. And the hope is that this younger generation will continue to mobilize with their energy, that we can wind up relying upon that, because the basis of your question is correct. The United States, support by the United States for Israel is the linchpin for maintaining the occupation, the apartheid, and the genocide. Finding ways of weakening and breaking that relationship is fundamental to being able to move ahead with respect to all of this.
Thank you very much. Yes, that is something that I've noticed is a lot of the action here has become much more strategic and organized in learning the lessons over these last couple of years. We're going to, unfortunately, Professor Michael Fakhri, the Special Rapporteur on the right to food, was not able to attend in person, but he did give us a video that we will play now. And following the video, we will have about a minute for any final comments, and then we will conclude.
Hello, my name is Michael Fakhri, and I am the UN Special Rapporteur on the right to food. Thank you so much for inviting me to speak at this very important event. However, due to my schedule and time difference, I can only provide a recorded video. I'm not going to go through the details of the horror of Gaza today. For 20 months, we, as independent human rights experts, myself and others, have raised the alarm over and over. We knew there was a risk of genocide starting in October 2023. We knew there was a famine and declared a famine a year ago. And yet here we are today with the horror continuing. And we've seen also Israel continuing to announce its starvation campaign. It announced its intent on October 9th, 2023 to starve the civilians in Gaza. And that's in fact what they did and that what they've been doing. And then most recently, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu on March 1st announced that nothing was to enter Gaza. And that's in fact what happened. From March 2nd to May 19th, no food, no water, no fuel, no medicine, nothing entered Gaza for approximately 78 days. And to put this into context, Israel has laid siege against Gaza for 25 years, since the year 2000. And so we are really at the point now where we're watching people die from hunger and malnutrition and related diseases from a weakened immune system at horrific rates. And yet Israel continues. And let's remember, Prime Minister Netanyahu announced this round of the starvation campaign, all while there's an outstanding warrant for his arrest and the arrest of former Israeli Minister of Defense Gallant. And part of the allegations is the war crime of starvation. This is the first time anyone's been charged with the war crime of starvation since the creation of the International Criminal Court. The International Court of Justice back in January recognized that there is conditions of famine and starvation in Gaza. Through my work and my reporting, I found also that there's famine and starvation. It's not just that Israel is denying and restricting humanitarian aid. Israel is also attacking the UN. There's a number of reports over the last 20 months of Israel attacking humanitarian convoys, of Israel attacking civilians seeking aid, of Israel attacking UN headquarters and killing a record number of UN staff, shooting at UN peacekeepers in southern Lebanon. And so I've heard ambassadors say that when Israel attacks the UN, it's attacking the world. It's also not just about humanitarian aid. Israel has been destroying the food system in Gaza by decimating fishing boats, by destroying orchards and greenhouses, by using white phosphorus, which poisons the soil, by destroying the water infrastructure. And so Israel is denying the Palestinian people's ability and their right to feed themselves today and in the future. So this is clearly a systemic campaign to humiliate, weaken, and deny the Palestinian people the ability to feed themselves. And then Israel then created the so-called Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, working closely with the American government. This started operating in late May, around May 25th. And even before it started operating, back in April, the Secretary General and the head of every UN humanitarian agency said this plan is not a humanitarian plan. This plan is a military plan. The UNICEF already said this was going to be a system to bait, to trap civilians. And unfortunately, this is in effect what has happened. So Gaza Humanitarian Foundation sites are militarized sites in which now there are continuous reports. So many people, over 100 people, have been killed by either Israeli forces or American mercenaries when they're trying to seek aid. So what is at stake here is that Israel has been using food and aid and starvation as a mechanism to humiliate, weaken, and kill the Palestinians as part of a larger strategy. And they've told us what this strategy is. It is to fully, indefinitely occupy Gaza, but all Palestinian territories, and ultimately annexation of the remaining Palestinian territories. There's a record number of violence and displacement that's happening in the West Bank and East Jerusalem. So yes, Gaza is the most horrific, but we're seeing Israel's broader strategy is the ultimate annexation of the remaining Palestinian territories. What can be done today? First and foremost, governments now are realizing they must act. Finally, after 20 months, we're seeing stronger statements by heads of state from all over the world, Western countries, developing countries, the global South, but we still need these words to turn into action. In the immediate term, countries can use the UN system to do something. When the Security Council is deadlocked because of a veto, as they are now, the General Assembly has power. So we see the US regularly veto any Security Council resolution calling for a ceasefire. Where there's such a deadlock at the Security Council, the General Assembly has the authority to call for peacekeepers to accompany humanitarian convoys to enter into Israel. That needs to happen today to stop the starvation campaign by Israel. Second, what countries can do is they must honor and execute the warrants by the International Criminal Court, but more importantly, they can use their own national criminal laws to make sure that Israeli war criminals are charged and held accountable for what they've done. And I'm seeing more and more countries, such as New Zealand, starting to screen Israelis who've served in the military, in the armed forces and military, and to try and screen out war criminals from entering the country in the first place. So this is what can happen in the immediate term. But in the more medium term, what countries must do is impose sanctions against Israel, broad-based sanctions, not just sanctions against settlers, but sanctions against the state of Israel. They're authorized to do so by the International Court of Justice in its recent decision finding the Israeli occupation to be illegal. The Court of Justice authorizes countries to sanction the state of Israel to make sure that Israel complies with international law. I wish you all the best for this important webinar, and thank you for focusing on this issue.
Thank you all. You'll have about a minute to wrap up your thoughts. That was very informative, and unfortunately, he's not here to have further discussion on it. He brought up several new ideas. Also, if anybody would like to comment directly on them, or you can make your final comments as you wish. Professor Lynk, let's start with you.
Sure. Let me just echo all that Michael Fakhri wound up saying. What I want to say that would extend and underline what he said is that international law is for everyone. International law is for everyone at all times and everywhere. It's never meant to be an umbrella that folds up the first sign of rain. It's never meant to be a menu a la carte where states, and particularly great powers, can choose what to obey and what to ignore. That's not the way international law was set up in the aftermath of the Second World War. We shouldn't be starry-eyed about what international law can deliver. International law today is in some ways at the mercy of international politics. And we've seen how international law has been stymied by the American veto at the Security Council, by the American and German delivery of military aid and weaponry to Israel, that it's increased during the past 22 months, notwithstanding the very clear warnings with respect to war crimes, crimes against humanity, and yes, even genocide being committed. At the end of the day, international law will not liberate Palestine, but it's a vitally important tool in our basket and in our toolbox to be able to say that every single country has signed on to all of these important humanitarian and human rights conventions, and we have to, as the voice of the general population, hold them accountable for what they are doing and what they're not doing with respect to advancing issues of justice and accountability that underline international law. Thank you very much.
Solomon Sacco, do you have any final words that you would like to say?
Thank you. It's very hard to have final words. We are watching this every day. We see people collapsing, dying. We get reports of children being shot as they try to get aid from JHF sites, food to survive. We have mothers telling stories of how their child went out to get aid and did not come back, either shot and killed or detained and ill-treated. The situation, I said catastrophic. It is absolutely horrendous. And yes, international law does mean something. International law must mean something. Nothing that we are seeing is lawful under international humanitarian law, international human rights law. It is time for states to take action, to heed the advice they were given by the International Court of Justice on a number of occasions, to take concrete steps to bring an end to the illegalities that we are seeing in the occupied Palestinian territories. Ultimately, it's up to powerful states to end this horror, and they can and they should. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your thoughts. Thank you, everyone. Thank you to all our distinguished speakers for your insights. Once again, it's been an honor to be here with you all. Thank you so much also to our attendees for being with us in solidarity with the Palestinian people and demanding immediate action from our world leaders who have been so grossly derelict in their duty to humanity and have allowed this level of atrocity to happen to the people in Gaza in particular. Inshallah, they will listen to the will of the people and start calling for some of these actions that we have talked about today. Thank you all for joining us.
Thank you.